Men like you don't wear that ink. The voice came low and sharp, cutting through the soft clink of ceramic and the quiet hum of a late-morning diner just off Route 17, a place where truckers drank burnt coffee and locals minded their own business, and for a moment, no one moved, not the waitress mid-pour, not the couple in the corner booth, not even the old jukebox whispering out a country song that suddenly felt too loud for the tension settling over the room, because every eye had shifted toward the man who spoke and the man he spoke to, one standing tall in a fitted jacket that couldn't quite hide the discipline of military posture, the other seated alone with a simple mug in his hand, his shoulders slightly hunched but not weak, never weak, his movements slow but deliberate as if time had taught him to waste nothing, not even a glance, and when Thomas Harlan finally looked up, his pale blue eyes didn't carry surprise or anger, just a quiet stillness that seemed to absorb the weight of the moment without reacting to it, like a lake untouched by the wind, while across from him Staff Sergeant Cole Mercer rested his hand on the edge of the table, fingers tapping once, then still, his gaze fixed on the faded ink on Harlan's forearm, a tattoo that looked almost forgotten, the lines worn thin, the shape uneven, a circle barely holding together around a 5-point star that wasn't quite centered, imperfect in every way that mattered to someone trained to notice precision. And Mercer noticed everything. He had built a career on it, built a reputation on separating what was real from what was imitation, and right now, everything about that mark told him one thing: it didn't belong. "I've seen every unit mark worth knowing," Mercer said, just loud enough for the room to hear, just controlled enough to keep it from sounding like a scene, and that one doesn't exist. A few men near the counter shifted in their seats, recognizing the tone more than the words, the kind of tone that didn't ask questions but issued quiet judgments, and still, Harlan said nothing, his thumb resting along the warm curve of the mug, his breathing steady, measured, as if the moment wasn't new to him, as if he had stood in places far more charged than this and learned long ago that silence could hold more power than any answer. Mercer leaned in slightly, not aggressive, not yet, but close enough that the space between them tightened. "So either you're confused," he continued, his voice lowering another notch, "or you're wearing something you didn't earn." The word earned hung there, heavy, deliberate, and for the first time, a subtle shift passed through the room, not loud, not obvious, but enough to change the air, because even those who didn't understand the symbol understood the accusation, and across the table, Harlan's eyes flickered down, just once, to the tattoo, not in shame, not in defense, but in recognition, like a man glancing at an old photograph he never needed to carry to remember, then back up again, meeting Mercer's stare with that same quiet calm that didn't challenge, didn't retreat, just remained, and it was that stillness, more than anything else, that unsettled the younger man, because it wasn't the reaction he expected, not from someone being questioned, not from someone being cornered, and behind the counter, Emily Carter felt it too, the way something about the old man didn't fit the picture Mercer was painting, the way his presence seemed anchored, like it belonged to a different time, a different weight of experience, and she found herself watching closer now, sensing something just beneath the surface, something not yet visible, but impossible to ignore, as Mercer's gaze hardened and his hand lifted slightly from the table, hovering just inches from the faded ink, his fingers poised as if to point, or to prove something, and in that suspended second, the diner held its breath. Mercer did not pull his hand back, not yet, his fingers hovering in that thin space between doubt and certainty as if the answer might reveal itself the moment he closed the gap, and his eyes narrowed slightly, studying the faded lines again, tracing the imperfect circle, the uneven star, the way the ink had settled into the skin like something done without care for symmetry or approval, and that only reinforced what he already believed, because nothing about it matched the clean precision of official markings, nothing about it followed the order he trusted, and yet the man wearing it did not flinch, did not shift, did not offer explanation or defense, and that silence began to press against Mercer's confidence in a way he did not expect, subtle at first, like a small weight added to something already balanced. "You hear me," Mercer said, a little more firmly now, not louder, but sharper, needing the moment to move in a direction he understood. "Units have structure, records, verification, that is how it works." He gestured lightly toward the tattoo without touching it, as if even acknowledging it too closely might grant it legitimacy. "There is no room for mystery." Across the table, Harlan finally set the mug down, slow and deliberate, the ceramic making a soft, grounded sound against the surface that seemed louder than it should have been. his hand resting there for a second longer than necessary before he lifted his gaze again, not challenging, not yielding, just present, and when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying the kind of calm that did not need volume to be heard. There are things that were never meant to be recorded. The words settled into the space between them, not defensive, not proud, just stated, and for a fraction of a second Mercer paused, the rhythm of his certainty interrupted, because that answer did not fit the categories he relied on, did not follow the script he had built. From years of training and verification, and behind him one of the other operators shifted slightly, the movement almost imperceptible but enough to signal that the moment was no longer as simple as it had been a minute ago. Mercer exhaled slowly through his nose, regaining control, grounding himself back in what he knew. Everything that matters gets recorded, he replied, his tone tightening just enough to draw a line. That is how we honor it, that is how we protect it. His eyes locked again on the tattoo, and this time his hand moved forward, not aggressively, but with intention, his finger stopping just short of the ink, close enough to see the texture of the skin, the way time had softened it. And the way the lines, though faded, had not been erased. This does not belong to anything I recognize, he said quietly, and there was something final in that statement, as if recognition itself defined truth, and anything outside it could not exist. Across the room Emily felt the shift deepen, the way the conversation had moved from casual to something heavier, something that carried weight beyond a simple disagreement. And she noticed the way the old man's posture had not changed at all. Not once, no tightening of the shoulders, no defensive movement, just that same grounded stillness that seemed to hold its place no matter how the pressure around it increased, and that was what unsettled her most, because it did not look like someone being confronted, it looked like someone who had already lived through something far more demanding and found this moment small. Mercer's finger finally closed the distance, brushing lightly against the edge of the faded circle. Not a strike, not a grab, just a brief contact meant to prove a point, to reduce the symbol to something ordinary, something dismissible, and in that instant, something changed, not in the room, not yet, but in the space behind Harlan's eyes, a shift so subtle it could have been missed, except it was not by Mercer, not by Emily, because for the first time since the exchange began, the stillness carried something else beneath it, something deeper, something that had been quiet for a very long time. The contact should have meant nothing, just a fingertip against old ink, a simple gesture meant to dismiss, but for Thomas Harlan the world did not stay inside the diner, not in that instant, because something older than the room, older than the conversation, stirred quietly beneath the surface of his memory, not loud, not overwhelming, just present, like a distant echo returning after years of silence. And his eyes did not close, did not shift away, but the focus behind them changed, as if he were looking through the moment instead of at it, and the faint hum of the diner, the soft scrape of chairs, the low murmur of voices all seemed to fall back, replaced by something else, something carried in memory. Rather than sound, a heavy stillness in the air, the kind that comes before decisions that cannot be undone, and though nothing around him moved, the weight of that memory settled into his posture, grounding him even further, if that was possible, while Mercer felt it without understanding it, the subtle shift in presence. The way the man across from him seemed less like someone being questioned and more like someone remembering something he did not need to explain, and it unsettled him in a way he could not immediately define, because Mercer trusted clarity, structure, verification, and this was none of those things. This was something quiet and untraceable, and his finger pulled back slightly, not fully retreating, just enough to break the contact, as if the gesture had not landed the way he intended. "You are saying there is no record," Mercer said, his tone adjusting, less sharp now, more probing, trying to regain ground through logic. "No documentation, no chain of command. Nothing that confirms what that is supposed to represent." He gestured again toward the tattoo, this time without touching it. "And you expect that to mean something?" Harlan did not respond immediately, his hand resting beside the mug, his fingers relaxed, not tense, not defensive, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried that same steady calm, but there was something deeper beneath it now. Something that had been stirred and was no longer entirely distant. It meant something to the men who wore it, he said, simple, direct, without emphasis, and that answer did not satisfy Mercer. It could not, because it did not provide the structure he needed. It did not give him a unit name, a designation, a reference point he could verify, and the absence of those things only reinforced his belief that the symbol did not belong, that it could not belong. Meaning is not enough, Mercer replied, the firmness returning to his voice, not when you are talking about something like that, and... Behind him one of the operators shifted again, this time more noticeably, not stepping in, not interrupting, but no longer entirely at ease with the direction of the exchange, because even without understanding the full weight of what was happening, they could feel it, the way the tension had shifted from confrontation to something more complex, something less certain, and across the room Emily wiped her hands on a towel she had forgotten she was holding, her eyes fixed on the two men, her instincts telling her that this was not just a disagreement about a mark on someone's arm, that something else was unfolding, something she did not have the full picture for, but could not ignore, and... She glanced toward the counter, toward the old rotary phone mounted near the register, a relic most people no longer noticed, except she did, because of something Harlan had said weeks ago in passing, a quiet remark about how some lines were not written down but still existed, and she felt that same quiet certainty now, the sense that this moment was connected to something larger than the room, while at the table Mercer straightened slightly, resetting his stance, reclaiming control of the situation through presence alone. Then tell me what it stands for, he said, not as a request, but as a test, a line drawn clearly now, because if the man across from him could not answer in a way that fit reality as Mercer understood it, then the conclusion would be simple, final, and justified, and for a second the diner held its breath again, waiting, as Harlan looked at him, not with defiance, not with reluctance, but with a kind of quiet consideration, as if weighing whether the answer itself mattered. Before he spoke, it stands for the ones who came back, he said, and then after the smallest pause, and the ones who did not, and the words did not rise, did not fall, they simply existed, and for reasons Mercer could not explain, they did not feel like an explanation, they felt like something else entirely, something that did not need to be proven to be true. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and quiet, and for a brief second Mercer said nothing, not because he agreed, but because the answer had shifted the ground beneath the conversation in a way he had not prepared for. It was not defiance, it was not an excuse, it was something else, something that did not try to convince him and therefore could not be easily dismissed, and that irritated him more than anything else, because uncertainty had no place in the system he trusted, and he straightened slightly, regaining control of his posture, his voice returning with a sharper edge. That is not how this works, he said, firm now, drawing a clear line back to the world he understood. You do not just carry a symbol and assign meaning to it after the fact. That is not how units operate, that is not how history is preserved. His gaze locked again on the faded ink, studying it not as memory but as evidence, something to be evaluated, categorized, accepted or rejected, and in his mind the conclusion was already forming, because if it could not be verified, it could not be real. There are standards, Mercer continued, his tone steady but unyielding, and those standards exist for a reason. Behind him one of the operators shifted his weight again, a subtle sign that the moment was stretching longer than expected, that something about it was no longer routine, while across the table Harlan remained exactly as he had been, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, but now there was something deeper in his eyes, not anger, not pride, but a quiet acknowledgement of what was being said, as if he had heard it before, many times, in many different forms, and had long ago decided it did not require an argument. He did not lean forward, did not raise his voice, he simply spoke. Standards change, he said, the words measured, not confrontational, but some things do not. Mercer's jaw tightened slightly at that, the conversation slipping again into territory that did not follow the rules he relied on, and he exhaled slowly, choosing his next move with care, because this was no longer just about a tattoo, it was about authority, about what could be accepted and what had to be rejected. And he could feel the eyes in the room, the weight of silent observation pressing in, expecting resolution, expecting clarity, and Mercer had built his reputation on providing exactly that. Then prove it, he said finally, the words direct, leaving no room for interpretation. Give me something real. Something that can be checked, something that exists beyond your word. The challenge hung in the air, clean and unmistakable, and for a moment the diner seemed to narrow around the table, every sound fading just enough to make the silence between them feel larger. Across the room Emily felt her pulse quicken, not from fear, but from the sense that the moment had reached a point where something had to give. That the quiet balance that had held until now was about to shift, and she glanced again toward the phone behind the counter, her mind replaying that offhand comment from weeks ago, the way Harlan had mentioned a number as if it were nothing important, and yet now it felt like the only thing that mattered. While at the table Harlan looked at Mercer for a long second, not measuring him, not judging him, simply seeing him, and there was something almost sympathetic in that look. Something that recognized the younger man's certainty for what it was, a belief built on experience, but not the whole of it, and when Harlan finally moved, it was not to argue, not to defend, but simply to reach into the inside pocket of his worn jacket, slow, deliberate, his fingers searching for something small, something old, and he placed it on the table between them without a word, a simple folded piece of paper, edges softened by time, unremarkable at first glance, but held with the same quiet care as everything else about him, and Mercer's eyes dropped to it instinctively, his focus narrowing, because whatever that was, it was the first thing in this entire exchange that looked like it might exist in his world, something tangible, something that could be examined, verified, confirmed or denied, and for the first time since the conversation began, the outcome no longer felt entirely certain. Mercer did not reach for the paper immediately, and that hesitation, small as it was, did not go unnoticed, because up until now every movement he had made carried certainty, speed, control, but this was different. This required a decision, and decisions implied doubt, even if only for a fraction of a second. His eyes studied the folded piece, taking in the worn edges, the faint discoloration that came with age, nothing official about it at first glance, no insignia, no visible marking that declared authority, just paper, ordinary and unimpressive, and yet the way Harlan had placed it on the table gave it weight, the kind of weight that did not come from appearance but from meaning, and Mercer finally moved, his hand steady as he reached forward and picked it up between his fingers, careful but not cautious. As if maintaining control even now mattered, he unfolded it slowly, the creases opening with a faint, dry sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the quiet room, and for a moment he said nothing, his eyes scanning the contents, adjusting, processing, and whatever he expected to find, it was not this, because there were no formal headers, no official seals, no structured layout that matched the documents he knew. Instead there were names, 5 of them, written in a clean, deliberate hand, spaced evenly, each one followed by a date that did not match any single timeline, not a mission date, not a deployment record, something else entirely, and at the bottom, a number, just a string of digits, no label, no explanation, just there, waiting. Mercer's brow tightened slightly as he read it again, trying to fit it into a system that made sense, but it did not align with anything he recognized, not a standard report, not a roster, not a code he could immediately identify, and that absence of familiarity created a quiet tension in his chest that he did not like. What is this supposed to be? He asked, his voice lower now, not dismissive, but measured, probing for structure where none was obvious. Across from him Harlan rested his hands lightly on the table, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady. It is what is left, he said simply, and the answer, once again, did not explain, it did not categorize, it did not simplify. It only added weight to something Mercer could not yet define. Behind him one of the operators leaned slightly forward, just enough to see the paper, curiosity beginning to edge into the space where confidence had been, because whatever Mercer was holding, it had shifted the dynamic, even if no one had said it out loud. Mercer exhaled slowly, his thumb brushing lightly over the names, feeling the indentation of the ink, the subtle texture of something written by hand, not printed, not processed, something personal, and that detail, small as it was, made it harder to dismiss, because official documents were clean, precise, uniform. This was not, this was imperfect, human. And yet it carried a presence that official records sometimes did not. These names do not appear in any database I have access to, Mercer said, almost to himself as much as to Harlan, his mind already running through possibilities, searching for a match, a reference, anything that would anchor this to reality as he understood it. And when he looked up again, there was a shift in his expression, not doubt, not acceptance, but something in between, something unresolved. And this number, he continued, tapping lightly at the bottom of the page, what is it? For the first time since placing the paper down, Harlan's gaze flickered toward it, just briefly, before returning to Mercer. It is the only one that still answers, he said, and the words, quiet and unforced, landed with a weight that could not be ignored, because they implied something still active, something not confined to memory or history, something that existed now, and that changed the equation entirely. Across the room Emily felt it too, the subtle shift from past to present, from story to something real, and without fully thinking it through, her eyes moved again toward the phone behind the counter, the old rotary dial waiting in silence, as if it had been part of this moment all along, while at the table Mercer looked down at the number once more, and for the first time since the conversation began, he was not entirely certain what would happen next. The number sat there on the page like something that did not belong to time, not past, not present, just waiting, and Mercer stared at it longer than he intended, his mind already working through protocols, through logic, through everything he had been trained to trust, because numbers meant systems, systems meant traceability, and traceability meant control, but something about this one felt different, not because of how it looked, but because of how it had been given to him, without explanation, without emphasis, as if the act of dialing it would speak louder than any argument, and that unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Anyone can write down a number, Mercer said finally, though his voice lacked the sharp edge it had carried before, as if he were reminding himself of something rather than stating it as fact, his eyes still fixed on the paper. That does not prove anything. Across from him Harlan gave the smallest nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if the statement itself was expected. Then call it, he said, and that was it, no challenge, no pressure, just a simple invitation that carried more weight than any demand could have, and for a moment Mercer did not move, the decision now sitting fully in his hands. Because calling meant stepping outside the controlled boundaries of what he understood, it meant risking uncertainty, and uncertainty was something he had spent his entire career eliminating. Behind him one of the operators shifted again, this time more openly, the tension no longer hidden, because even without knowing what the number meant, they could feel that this moment mattered, that whatever happened next would not be easily undone. Across the room Emily's attention snapped fully to the counter, to the old rotary phone mounted beside the register, its cord coiled loosely, untouched for most of the day, and without waiting for permission, without asking, she moved, her steps quick but controlled, reaching for it with hands that felt steadier than she expected. She lifted the receiver, the faint hum of the open line filling her ear, and she turned slightly toward the table, her eyes meeting Harlan's for just a second, and he gave the slightest nod, not commanding, not directing, just allowing, and that was enough. Mercer watched the movement, his focus shifting from the paper to the phone, the reality of the situation becoming impossible to ignore, because now the number was no longer theoretical, it was about to be tested. You do not have to do this, one of the operators said quietly from behind him, not as an order, but as a reminder, a way out if Mercer wanted it. But Mercer did not respond, because stepping back now would mean accepting uncertainty without resolution, and that was something he could not do, not here, not in front of his team, not in front of this man who had not once raised his voice or his posture. Mercer stood, slow and deliberate, taking the paper with him as he walked toward the counter, each step measured, controlled, but carrying a weight that had not been there before. Emily held the receiver out to him without a word, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp, watching, waiting. Mercer took it, the plastic cool against his hand, grounding in a way that felt familiar, and he looked down at the number one more time, committing it to memory as if that would somehow restore control. Then he began to dial, each rotation of the rotary wheel slow, deliberate, the clicks echoing softly in the quiet diner, drawing every eye in the room toward him, and when the final digit returned to its place, the line went still for a fraction of a second before the sound came through, a single tone, then another, steady, consistent, and for the first time since this began, Mercer felt something he had not expected, not doubt, not fear, but anticipation, because whatever answered on the other end of that line was about to define everything. The line rang twice, clean and uninterrupted, and then it stopped, not with the click of a casual answer, but with a silence that felt deliberate, measured, as if whoever was on the other end had already been there, already listening, and when the voice came through it was not rushed, not confused, just calm, controlled, and unmistakably precise. "This line is restricted," the man said, his tone even, carrying no emotion and no room for interpretation, and Mercer straightened instinctively, his grip tightening slightly on the receiver, every instinct telling him this was no ordinary connection. "Identify yourself," the voice continued, and Mercer hesitated for the briefest moment, not out of uncertainty, but because this was not how civilian lines operated. This was structured, procedural, familiar in a way that immediately shifted the ground beneath him. "Staff Sergeant Cole Mercer," he replied, his voice steady, falling naturally into the cadence of protocol. "United States Army." There was a pause, not long, but long enough to feel intentional, followed by the faintest sound of something being entered, verified, checked against something unseen, and then the voice returned, unchanged but now carrying a subtle shift. "That line was not issued to you, Staff Sergeant," it said, not accusatory, just factual, and Mercer's eyes flicked briefly toward the table where Harlan still sat, unmoving, his presence unchanged, as if this moment had already played out in his mind long before the call was ever made. "I am aware," Mercer answered, choosing his words carefully, because whatever this was, it demanded precision. "I was given this number." Another pause followed, shorter this time, sharper, and when the voice spoke again, it carried a different weight, something more focused, more direct. "By whom?" The question landed with quiet force, and Mercer did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because saying the name suddenly felt like crossing a line he did not fully understand. But he had already dialed, already stepped into this, and there was no path back that would preserve clarity. "Thomas Harlan," he said, each word clear, deliberate, and the effect was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. The silence on the line stretched, not empty, but filled with something shifting, something being recognized, and then came a sound Mercer did not expect, not a question, not a denial, but the faintest exhale, controlled, restrained, as if the name had triggered something deeper than protocol. And when the voice returned, it was still calm, still measured, but no longer neutral. "Repeat the name," it said, and this time it was not a request, it was a confirmation, and Mercer felt it. The shift in authority, the change in tone that did not need to raise its volume to assert itself. "Thomas Harlan," he repeated, and the response came immediately, without hesitation. "Stay where you are," the voice said, firm now, decisive. "Do not leave that location." Mercer's jaw tightened slightly, his training kicking in, recognizing an order when he heard one, even if it came from an unseen source. "Identify yourself," Mercer replied, not out of defiance, but out of necessity, because protocol demanded it. And for a second there was no answer, just a quiet hum of the line, and then the voice spoke again, slower this time, each word placed with intention. "You are not authorized to ask that question," it said, and the finality of it left no room for negotiation. Mercer held the receiver in silence for a moment longer, the weight of what had just happened settling in, before the line went dead, not abruptly, not harshly, just ended, as if the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. And when Mercer lowered the receiver back onto the cradle, the soft click echoed louder than it should have, because the room had gone completely still, every eye fixed on him now, waiting, searching for answers he did not yet have, and for the first time since this began, the certainty that had defined his posture, his voice, his presence, was no longer absolute. The silence after the call did not feel empty, it felt occupied, as if something unseen had already begun moving long before anyone in the diner understood it, and Mercer stood there for a second longer than necessary, his hand still resting lightly on the receiver as though letting go of it completely would force him to accept what had just happened, because nothing about that exchange had followed the patterns he knew. Nothing had given him a clear answer, and yet everything about it had carried authority he could not ignore. He turned slowly, his posture still controlled but no longer rigid, his eyes finding Harlan again, and for the first time there was something different in that look, not respect, not yet, but awareness, the kind that comes when certainty begins to crack under pressure it cannot explain. "Someone is coming," Mercer said, his voice steady but quieter now, the words more statement than command. And Harlan gave a slight nod, not surprised, not relieved, just acknowledging what he had already known, as if the outcome had never been in question. Across the room Emily sat, her hands on the counter, steadying herself without realizing it, her eyes moving between the two men, feeling the shift that had taken place, the way the balance of the room had tilted without a single raised voice or sudden movement. It was not chaos, it was something heavier, something deliberate, like the moment before a storm arrives. Outside the diner the road remained quiet, the late morning sun casting long reflections across the glass windows, but then, faint at first, came a sound. That did not belong to the stillness, the low hum of engines approaching, not loud, not aggressive, just precise, controlled, and Mercer heard it immediately, his head turning slightly toward the door, his instincts recognizing the pattern before his thoughts could fully process it. The vehicles did not rush, they did not announce themselves, they arrived with purpose, one after another, stopping cleanly along the edge of the lot as if guided by a single instruction. Inside the diner no one spoke, no one moved, the attention drawn outward now, toward whatever was unfolding beyond the glass. Mercer's team shifted subtly behind him, their posture tightening, not defensive, but alert, because they recognized it too, the structure, the coordination, the quiet efficiency of something organized at a level that did not require explanation, and Mercer felt it settle into his chest. That same unfamiliar weight from the call, now taking shape in the real world. The door opened with a soft chime, the sound almost too ordinary for the moment it carried, and a man stepped inside, not hurried, not hesitant, just composed, his presence filling the space without effort, his uniform immaculate, his posture exact, every movement measured in a way that spoke of decades rather than years. Conversations did not resume, they did not even attempt to, because the room understood something had shifted beyond ordinary authority. The man's eyes moved once across the diner, taking in the scene, the people, the tension that still hung in the air, and then they settled on Harlan, and for a brief second something passed between them, not spoken, not obvious, but unmistakable, recognition, not of a face, but of something deeper, something shared. Mercer straightened instinctively, every part of his training responding before his mind caught up, because he knew what he was looking at, even if he did not yet understand why, and the man took a single step forward, his gaze never leaving Harlan as he spoke, his voice calm, controlled, carrying a quiet authority that did not need volume to command the room. "Thomas," he said, not as a question, not as a challenge, but as confirmation, and in that moment, without anyone announcing it, without anyone explaining it, the entire room understood that whatever this was, it had just reached its turning point. Harlan did not stand immediately, he did not rush to meet the man who had just entered, because nothing about him had ever been rushed, and when he finally rose from his seat it was with the same quiet control he had carried through the entire moment, his chair sliding back with a soft sound that seemed to echo more than it should, and the man in uniform stopped a few feet away, not out of distance, but out of respect, the kind that does not need to be explained. Their eyes met fully now, and for a brief second the diner, the people, the tension, all of it faded into the background, leaving only the weight of recognition between two men who did not need introductions. "General Hale," Harlan said, his voice calm, as if he were greeting someone from a different time rather than a different place, and the general gave the slightest nod, not formal, not distant, just real. "You kept it," Hale replied quietly, his eyes dropping for a moment to the faded tattoo on Harlan's arm, and then, without another word, he reached up and rolled his sleeve back, slow and deliberate, revealing the same mark, the same imperfect circle, the same uneven star, worn by time but unmistakable, and the effect on the room was immediate and absolute. No one spoke, no one moved, because the explanation that Mercer had demanded, the proof he had required, had just been given without a single argument, without a single raised voice. Mercer felt it before he fully processed it, the shift from doubt to certainty, the collapse of everything he had built his judgment on in the last few minutes. His eyes locked on the matching ink, searching for differences, for flaws, for anything that would restore the structure he depended on, but there was none, only confirmation, and slowly, almost without realizing it, his posture changed, the rigid certainty easing into something quieter, something more grounded, the kind of understanding that does not come from instruction but from realization. Behind him his team had already adjusted, their stance no longer casual, no longer questioning, but aligned, aware of the weight of what they were witnessing. Hale lowered his sleeve again, his attention returning fully to Harlan. "We thought you were gone," he said, not as an accusation, but as something carried for a long time, and Harlan gave a faint, almost amused breath through his nose. "I was," he answered, simple as that, no explanation, no elaboration, just truth in its smallest form. Hale studied him for a second longer, then gave a single nod, as if that was enough, because for men like them, it always had been, and then, without looking away from Harlan, he spoke again, his voice carrying just enough to reach the room. that mark was never meant to be recorded, he said, calm, precise, because the men who wore it were never meant to exist. The words settled into the silence, not dramatic, not emphasized, just stated, and that was all it took. Mercer lowered his gaze briefly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, understanding. Now that what he had tried to measure could not be measured the way he had been taught, that some things existed outside of records, outside of systems, and yet carried more truth than anything written down, he stepped forward once, controlled, deliberate, and spoke, "Sir," the word directed to Harlan, not as a formality, but as something earned, and Harlan looked at him, not surprised, not expecting it, just accepting it the same way he had accepted everything else, without needing it, without rejecting it. Mercer gave a small nod, nothing exaggerated, nothing performative, just respect in its simplest form, and that was enough. Harlan reached for his jacket, slipping it on with the same unhurried movement, and without another word he stepped past Mercer, past the table, past the moment that had drawn everyone in, and headed toward the door. The bell chimed softly as he pushed it open, the sunlight catching briefly on the worn fabric of his sleeve before he stepped outside, and just like that, he was gone, not leaving behind a victory, not leaving behind a statement, just leaving, the way he always had, quietly. Hale watched him go for a second, then turned slightly, his gaze passing over Mercer and the others, not with judgment, but with understanding, before he followed, the door closing gently behind him, and the diner slowly exhaled, the tension dissolving into something quieter, something reflective, because no one there would forget what they had just seen, not because of what was said, but because of what was not, and in the space left behind, the meaning settled on its own, clear without explanation, that respect is not something you demand, it is something you recognize when you are finally ready to see it.